Hello, my name is Adam Gray, and I'd like to welcome you to this science strategy lesson. Now, you're going to love this one because there's probably no other video, no other lesson in the course that is going to help you on as many questions as this one. There are over 100 passage-based science questions you're going to see on test day. And this lesson, Science Passage Strategy, is going to give you the methods and strategies you need to move through those passages, get the information you need, and get past them to the questions that will give you the points you deserve. So what we're going to see here is a lot of science passages. What we're not going to see are a lot of questions just yet. Now don't worry, there's going to be a lot of time for questions later on in the course, and you're going to spend a lot of time with those. But here it is all about those passages. First, the method, or our primary strategy for going through passages on the MCAT. And if you recognize this method, which, well, you should if you've done any study on the CARS section so far, it is in fact the same method that you'll be using on the CARS section of the exam. Passages, either in the CARS or the science sections, require the same strategy. That strategy is first to scan the passage. A very quick 5 to 10 second scan of structure. See what stands out and determine what you think the passage might be about and how hard you think it's going to be for you. Secondly, that you read the passage strategically, looking for test-worthy information. Third, that as you read each paragraph or item, you label it in an outline that you put together as you write. And then lastly, before you move to the questions, reflect on your outline, read it through to make sure you have the gist of what the passage was all about. Our learning goals for this lesson are going to align directly with the steps of that strategy. Our first objective will be to show you how to preview a science passage, how to handle that first step of the method. The second will be about how to read strategically and identify that question-relevant information. And then the third about how to make passage outlines, which you're going to be very used to by the time you get to test day. The context through which we're going to see this lesson about passages will be in the following science topics: intermolecular forces, organic chemistry reactions, and translational motion. Now, we're not going to be learning all of these three topics of science, but the passages that we see will be about these sciences. But before we move on, I want to direct your attention to the lower right of your screen and the fact that the skill we are building with this lesson is MCAT expertise. Now, there are 4 science, inquiry, and reasoning skills that the AAMC says you need to train for test day, and you are going to train those. There are a lot of lessons on those, but this is one of our lessons about specific MCAT test day behavior. Smart test takers, high scorers, like you're going to be when you take your test, they understand that it's not enough to be a science expert or an encyclopedia of knowledge to get a high score on the MCAT. You also have to be an MCAT expert. That means you need to know how to navigate the exam, how to move through passages quickly, how to use your time efficiently throughout the day, how to deal with wrong answer choices, and all of those MCAT-specific behaviors. In these MCAT expertise lessons, you're going to learn those behaviors, and then in your practice and homework between now and test day, you're going to practice them hundreds of times until you know them like a second nature, and until you've got an encyclopedia of MCAT knowledge and expertise to apply on test day. So we're going to start with this first learning goal. It's about the first step, the scan step of our major strategy, and it is about previewing a science passage. So when you see a science passage on test day, your first glance, when you make that first scan step, you shouldn't actually, in your mind's eye, see the entire passage. What you should see is this. Now, notice, there's a whole lot of gray text here. From here all the way down to here, and then if you look in your book, there's a considerably more of it in the rest of this passage. That's because when you do that first step, the scan step, you should read the first sentence or so of the passage, and then scan the rest of it to see what stands out. Because what that's going to show you is what the passage is basically about, and it's going to give you just enough information that after you've done it several dozens or several hundreds of times, you are going to get a good gut reaction of, am I going to do this passage now, or am I going to skip it on test day? That is a skill called triaging the section, which you're going to be building explicitly later, but you need to start doing right now every time you see a passage because you've got to build it immediately. So the next thing you need to do is write down on your page an answer to that first question on this page. What do you notice in the first sentence? Just anything important that you notice, just reading the very first sentence and nothing else. What you can see in the first sentence is that this is a passage about cell cytoplasm. That is in literally the first 3 words of the passage. And when you get a chance to read this whole passage, which you will, don't worry, you'll see the entire passage does not really stray from that main topic. And that means that you, by identifying this is about the cell cytoplasm, can already say to yourself, well, I know a lot about the cytoplasm, I think I can do this passage. Or, well, I don't know much about it, and so I won't. The next step of the scan step and how to preview a passage successfully is seeing what is beyond that first sentence. And in this case, that's right here in the rest of the passage. Again, handily grayed out to show how an expert eye would scan this. You'll see here what isn't grayed out are these words that are all capital letters or abbreviations or italicized. And these words naturally should stand out to you structurally in the passage. You should use that to your advantage because these are not just any words. These are words like ATP, KCAT, Vmax, Mg, magnesium. And that also tells you more about what the passage is about. Again, this can happen in just seconds if you are up to look for it. Finally, you can find out what figures are present. And the figures that are present here, it's a table about magnesium. Remember, you don't need to know any more than these very, very quick evaluations when you're doing just the preview step on test day. This entire process, even though it took about 5 minutes to talk through now, is going to take you about 5 seconds to do on test day. So let's do it with another passage and take a little bit less time. This passage is a little bit shorter, but it's even simpler to scan than the last passage. Based on just what you can see at a glance that isn't grayed out, what science topic is being tested? Yep, when you see that figure down there, structure of sphingomyelin and that big old organic molecule, that means this is going to be organic chemistry or biochemistry. And you, as a student, you should already know how much you like organic chemistry or biochemistry, and developing that gut feeling of how much you think a passage is going to give you trouble is what the preview step, the scan step, is all about. Now, you may also have written down intermolecular forces because van der Waals forces are mentioned right up there. And that's great too, just as equally legitimate an answer to that first question. Now, you may think this is easy, you may think this is hard. You might really like organic chemistry, or it might not be your cup of tea. And whatever your answer to that is would say whether or not you would skip this passage on test day. If you see that molecule and your eyes roll to the back of your head and you say, oh my gosh, this again? Well then, you'll probably skip this passage on test day. And that is the strength of the scan step. If you only spend 5 seconds looking at something and then you're able to skip it, you've saved yourself a lot of time that you could spend on easier passages. And again, it's going to be a lot more on triage later on in the program, but here it's all about that single scan step, which here we've done successfully. Let's preview one more passage before we move into a more in-depth dissection of these passages. You'll notice in your book that there are actually 6 prompts next to this passage, prompts you should be able to answer really quickly just by scanning the passage and really trusting your gut feeling. Go ahead and answer those now. Let's see one by one how you might have answered these. In the first sentence, we notice this passage is about automobile safety. The MCAT science passages are not long enough to be about more than 1 or 2 major topics, so when you see automobile safety in those first 4 words, you know that's what this is going to be about, and so you know what you're getting into if you choose to do this passage right now. The rest of the passage has references like this, numerical ones or formulaic ones, 30G, and that combined with the equation that is embedded in the middle of the passage and the graph that's at the end of it Tell us this is probably a physics passage. You see V's and T's, probably even a translational motion passage. That is what is almost certainly being tested here, even if you only take a quick 5-second scan of the passage. It's pretty cool. And you have probably given your own individualized answer to this second to last prompt about how hard you think this will be for you. Physics might be your strong suit. It might not be your strong suit. Physics might be your strong suit, but specifically translational motion is not your strong suit. Either way, you should know, hey, I think I can handle this one, or no, I don't think I can, and that will inform your answer to the last question, whether or not you would skip this passage on test day. Note that the entire scan step really comes down to this question. Would you skip the passage on test day? It's the biggest takeaway. And that's what the scan step is all about. You start doing it right now, every single passage that you see, and you are going to train your instincts to whether or not you want to do a passage now or do it later. It's going to be one of the most important decisions you make many, many times on test day. So that does it for the first part of this lesson, which is all about building up an instinctive gut reaction, something that you can trust as a do it or not do it feeling. But the rest of this lesson is not going to be about gut reactions. It's going to be about active things you are doing on test day. Specifically for this learning goal, it's going to be about what happens in your head as you read a passage. This is all about step 2 of our strategy for science passages. Read strategically to notice the most question-relevant information. And an important detail here is that question-relevant information does not mean the same thing on the science sections as it does on the cars sections, as we'll see. What we're going to do is we're going to move through 2 passages here, or more 2 passage samples. They're pretty short. And 1 biochemistry, 1 organic chemistry. And we're going to ask the same 3 questions for each one. What knowledge are you going to need to answer questions from this passage once you see the questions? What information from the passage is most likely to be tested, and what isn't the most likely to be tested? This first one we'll go through together. Now, you don't have to answer the questions yet, but read this passage to yourself right now, and you'll notice it's one of our passages from the previous learning goal. See if your suspicions about the passage from last learning goal were confirmed. Go ahead and read it now. So, as it turns out, we were right. Back from the last learning goal, we thought this was going to be about the cytoplasm and intermolecular forces and ATP and enzyme kinetics, and sure enough, that is exactly what kind of outside science knowledge we are going to need for this. And you might be thinking, well, wait a second, how do I know what knowledge I need to answer the questions if the questions aren't being shown to me? But this is the key about MCAT science passages. The MCAT makes them very similarly every single time. And we have already seen throughout the years of MCAT administrations, even over test changes, that they keep the same patterns. The science topics that they throw into a passage, yes, they're going to ask you about the passage, but they're also going to ask you about other neighboring facts about science. So even though this passage ends up being about enzyme kinetics and how magnesium works as an inhibitor or a activator of enzymes, this passage could very easily have questions about bioenergetics because it's about ATP. It could very easily have different aspects of enzyme kinetics. It could very easily ask about intermolecular forces like van der Waals forces that aren't even mentioned in this passage at all. And so when you read a passage and you see these topics, you should already be expecting questions on these topics. That's why these are details that are important to pay attention to. And that leads us right into what is likely to be drawn directly from the passage, which is all of this, silly to say it, science-y stuff. Every single science buzzword that you see, when you see a word like intermolecular forces, or a word like ATP, or a word like magnesium, or all of that data that's in the table, you should be expecting, you know what? Yeah, this is what I'm going to see for questions. So these are the paragraphs that I can't afford to not pay attention to. These are the paragraphs that I really need to understand and get good labels of, because this is what's most likely to have questions on. A great example is the table itself that we see later on here. Almost every single table in the history of the MCAT has had at least one question on it. Now, you're not going to need to know every single cell of this table. You might need to know one or two, or the relationship between a few of them, or a major trend, but you will need to use this in some way, so it's important to pay attention to, and as we'll see in our next learning goal, write down what this table actually shows us. In contrast, and this is the really valuable part of the read strategically step, if we know the pattern of MCAT passages, which we do and which we're going through and exploring right now, we know that we don't have to pay that much attention to descriptive information or qualitative information, historical information, everything that is not a science, everything that is not an experiment, everything that's not something a researcher tried to do, everything that is pure human level background information, that's not going to be directly tested. And we're going to see even better examples of that in our next passage. Speaking of which, do this one on your own. Read this passage sample and answer the 3 prompts on your page. Write down those answers and then we will go through it together. So this passage, as you probably quickly noticed, is a new passage. We didn't see it in the previous learning goal, and it's all about organic chemistry. If you didn't see it in the first word and notice that styrene is this organic molecule, maybe remember styrene from other places in your life, then you definitely noticed it when you got to the 3rd paragraph, which has a whole bunch of formulas everywhere and lots of different reactions, and boy oh boy does this scream organic chemistry. That's something you would have noticed in the scan step. It's something that gets even more confirmed in the read strategically step. And along those same lines, that 3rd paragraph is exactly what's most likely to be tested here. It is the part you can't afford to miss. But in contrast, these first 2 paragraphs, the paragraphs that hit on things like how we use styrene industrially, what it looks like even, that it's a mutagen, that it might be a carcinogen. I mean, those are important facts. You might read about them in the news, but you're probably not going to get questions about them on test day. Yes, of course, you might get a question that refers you back to that paragraph, but there is not a question that's going to integrate that information in a very complicated way, like you might see on, for instance, the cars section. So if when you answered these yourself, you said, hey, 3rd paragraph, really test worthy, first 2, not so much, then you are absolutely right on track. If not, then as you continue to read passages, and you're going to get a chance to do even more just in the next learning goal, then you should continue to look for this. The more science topic, the more science classy it gets, the more test worthy. The less so, the more historical, descriptive, the more qualitative things get, a little bit less test worthy. And so if you read it and don't really get it the first time around, maybe you didn't even really understand the first 2 paragraphs of this sample when you read it, that's okay, because you're probably not going to get a lot of questions on it. And you don't want to spend more than about 3 minutes reading a passage on test day if you can avoid it. So saving that time, definitely not skipping a paragraph entirely. Don't do that. But saving the time of not rereading or stressing about unlikely test material is going to save you tons of time. So that was a quick trip on how to read strategically on the science sections, what to look out for. And learning goal number 2 was all about what should be going on in your head as you read a passage. What learning goal number 3 is about, and this one is really important, it's the most important one in this lesson, it's about what goes on your page, on your scratch paper. Not what you think as you read a passage, but what you write down as you read a passage. Yes, you are going to be taking notes on test day, you're going to be making an outline, but as you'll see, just as you may have already learned about outlines on the cars section, they're going to be very brief. They're going to help you understand the passage in the first place, the first time you read it, and they're also going to help you answer questions by getting you really quick references. And by the end of this lesson, you're going to be better at creating them. What we're going to do is we're going to make one outline together, moving through a passage. Another one we'll recognize from earlier in the lesson, and then you'll get a chance to make one yourself and see how close you got to a good, concise passage outline. Then, even after this lesson, you'll get more of a chance to practice and check your passage outlines against Kaplan's passage outlines in your homework and throughout the full course. So before we dive into that first passage, let's just review what a passage outline looks like. Or if you haven't seen this in the cars section yet, it'll be your first chance to see what this looks like. What a passage outline is on your scratch paper, P1, P2, P3, and then after each P, there's a summary or label, a paragraph, and we're really talking a label, just a few words. If you're going over 6 or 7 words for these labels, they're probably too long, and so they really shouldn't take more than a couple seconds to write down. That is going to be time well spent and well invested because it'll help you understand the passage better when you first read it and help you answer questions later. One thing that is different and unique about the science sections is that you will also be labeling other elements of the passage, like equations or sometimes figures that are with the passage, writing down a few short words about that. And don't worry, we will see an example of how to label these in just a moment. The other difference between outlines for science passages and cars passages is that for science passages, we don't write down a goal at the end during the reflect step. We do on cars passages because there are a lot of questions on the cars section about goals and whole purposes, but we don't see those questions so much on science passages, so we just get a label for each paragraph and other element and leave it at that. This is the passage that we will use as our first exhibit in terms of how to make an outline. You'll probably recognize it as that kinematics passage, or what we thought was a kinematics passage from learning goal number 1. But before we even really dive into this, look at the facing page of your book and you'll see there's already a framework for you there. Now, of course, on test day, that framework won't already be there for you. And so the first thing you will do on test day with your scratch work, and whenever you practice at home, is write down P1, P2, P3, and in this case there's an equation embedded in P3, P4, and then figure 1. You'll have your framework all ready to fill in as you read the passage, which let's start that off now. Paragraph 1 is the first paragraph we'll read and label here, and you'll notice it's pretty short. It's only 2 lines. It's only 1 sentence. And so your reaction might be, hold on, this is only 1 sentence. Why do I have to write a label for it? Do I have to write a label for it? The answer is yes, you do. And the reason why is because you don't want to be there on test day not only having to write out labels and read carefully, but deciding whether you're going to label every paragraph. That's just one more step you don't need. If you read the paragraph knowing you're going to have to label it, you can label it really quickly. And that's what we can do here. We even saw in our scan step, the paragraph 1 is about auto safety and 3 factors of it. And that's all we have to write here. Paragraph 2 is going to have some new information that we haven't really seen yet. So go ahead and read that one on your own and write out your best approximation for a label. Paragraph 2, in its first sentence, really tells us that this is about innovations in passenger safety in automobiles. This is the paragraph that had that reference of 30G, and that was when it was talking about seat belts. And you may have also noticed that within this paragraph there was essentially a list. 3 different innovations. You had the seat belt, you had airbags, and you had crumple zones. And those basic facts about the paragraph can help us make our label. A good label for this paragraph is, there have been some safety innovations, and here's a short list of them. Now, your label that you wrote probably doesn't match that exactly, but that's fine. And we'll even see in just a moment some alternate forms of passage outlines that work just as well. For instance, you may not have listed out the 3 items. You may have phrased things slightly differently. But as long as it got the gist of it, there was about a list of safety innovations, and it's not any longer than this one, doesn't crack that 7-word mark, you're really on the right track. There's also a quick side note here if you've been paying attention. Paragraphs 1 and 2 actually don't have very much test-worthy information in them. It's a lot of historical, qualitative information. A list of safety innovations is not the sort of thing that's going to show up on the science section of the test. The science section of the test is going to ask you how seatbelts influence forces on internal organs, or it might ask you about things that come up later in the passage. So the takeaway for that is that if you read paragraphs 1 and 2 and got just about this much to write down about them, you don't have to worry very much more about them. And you probably won't even have to go back during a question. And the great news is, if you do have a question that points you directly to one of those safety innovations, you know exactly where to go. Now we can move on to paragraph 3, and remember, equation 1 is embedded in paragraph 3 as well. This, in contrast to the previous 2 paragraphs, is where we will really get into the science stuff. So go ahead, read this paragraph, and write down your labels for both paragraph 3 and equation 1 right now. Paragraph 3 spends its first sentence in still not very test-worthy territory, auditory acuity and so on. But then right afterwards we get to the really juicy stuff. Reaction time. We've got a variable embedded right here in the paragraph, T reaction, that shows up again in the equation down below. We get lots of variables called out. V, we got D, all of these. Later on after the paragraph we get A, and these should all ring about 100 bells in your head about kinematics, translational motion. These are the sorts of questions that are going to be attached to this passage. To answer the questions that we answered about the passages back in our last learning goal, the type of outside knowledge we're going to need is that of kinematics, translational motion, and that entire family of physics stuff. So now let's compose the best possible labels that we can with this really juicy science stuff. For paragraph 3, a good label is stopping distance, reaction time. There was a little more than that present in the paragraph, but this is the really MCAT relevant stuff. And then for equation 1, something close to minimum safe distance. That could even be your only 3 words. Here we've got a few more between car and hazard because that is in fact what the equation is. But if you're ever wondering what to label an equation when you're making an outline, always go for, well, there's a variable on the left side of the equation, because there usually is, all by itself. What does that variable stand for? In this case, the passage tells us it stands for the minimum safe distance. And then if you get a question that ever brings up that term, what is the minimum safe distance, blah, 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 you know exactly where to go back to and exactly what equation to use. Let's move on now to paragraph 4. Go ahead and read this one now and write down your label. Paragraph 4, as with paragraph 2, has a lot of details. We learn a new acronym, ATD, which stands for Anthropomorphic Test Devices. We learn a lot of things they put in these ATDs, accelerometers, force transducers, so on and so forth. But really, we want a very short label. That's our goal. And the best label for paragraph 4? It's crash test dummies. That's what this whole paragraph is about. And you know, if you don't really internalize the rest of the details from that paragraph, and this is all you write down, that's okay. Because paragraph 4 is the only paragraph, the only part of the passage that is about crash test dummies. So if you get any question that references them, you always know where to go if you don't remember what it was about. And in a lot of ways, paragraph 4 is similar to paragraph 2. A lot of qualitative, non-science fact information. Let's put in the final puzzle piece here and make our label for figure 1. This is what figure 1 looks like. Finish up your passage outline by writing out your label for this figure, keeping in mind that the best labels for figures usually answer the question, what is being displayed here? And what's nice is the MCAT answers that question, what is being displayed here, pretty darn clearly with its own label that it's giving to the figure. It's the acceleration of the crash dummy head with and without an airbag. And now what you shouldn't do is copy those words exactly as your label. But if you aren't sure based on the context, the
passage and what the figure actually looks like, you can always fall back to the label to help you out. Another good thing to notice about figures before you move past them and onto the questions is what's on the axes and any big trends that you see. In this case, we have an acceleration on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. We have two different lines of airbags, absent and present. And the big trend here is that when you don't have an airbag, that dotted line, boy oh boy, does that crash dummy head go through a lot of acceleration. If it were a person, that would probably be some pretty painful acceleration too. And those short takeaways, what's on the axes and any big trends, are good to put in your label as well. For a more concrete example, you could have something written, graph of dummy head acceleration. That can be it. Now, again, you could have written a little more, a little less, could have phrased it a little bit differently. But the ultimate non-negotiable fact about passage outlines, as your Kaplan tip says at the bottom of your page, is that when you make an outline, you write down what you notice about the passage. It's important to follow step 2 of the strategy, that you read strategically to notice the right things, but then you also have to write them down. So in a way, the 4-step method sometimes contracts to 2 steps. Train yourself to notice the right things and then make sure you write those things down. Now before we move to our next and last passage of this lesson, there's a theme I've already mentioned a few times, that you don't need to match Kaplan's passage outline, like the one on the screen right now, perfectly in order to have a good passage outline. So let's look at a few example passage outlines for this last passage that were all really good, but all totally different. This is a similar exercise to what you might have already done with Cars passages in the Cars passages lesson, but it's separately useful for the science passages to see how these passage outlines can rightfully and legitimately differ from one another. Here's one. Notice some key facts here, that it is a little bit shorter than what we saw on the previous page, that it puts things in a different order, that it doesn't say crash test dummy at any point. It only says ATD throughout. This is a great passage map. But so is this one. Wow, this got even shorter. But it's also a great passage outline because whoever wrote this, presumably, still read strategically, noticed what they needed to notice, and in their own language, it was enough to write just car safety for paragraph 1, or just crash tests on paragraph 4, or just distance to stop car for equation 1. And this will be just as useful for whoever wrote it as the other ones we've seen. Finally, here's one that is the opposite. Stretches things out even a little bit more. Now, this is an example of just about as long as you would ever want a passage outline to be, but ultimately, if your passage outline looks a lot like this, as long as you didn't take too much time to write it, sit there for 30 seconds or so to decide exactly how to phrase out every word, you're probably doing fine. The point of seeing these 3 different examples is to show that you need to create your own internal style on how to make passage outlines. You do need to make them to succeed on the test. They're really, really important, and they're a big part of what separates your high scorers from your okay scorers, people who take really good notes. You need to take them, but you need to take them on your own terms and build your own language. It's one of the reasons why practice and hard work consistently are so important with this skill. Now is your chance to build your own passage outline. You'll recognize this paragraph from the last learning goal. It is our good old friend styrene, but it in fact has grown a little bit. It's a little bit longer, and now it has an image. Go ahead and read this passage and make your own outline now. Make it according to the principles that we have just seen. Here's a nice sample outline, and notice how every label is nice and concise. Paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 we actually saw back in learning goal number 2. That first one is about basic info on styrene, second one is about human physiology, and the third is about synthesis. The third paragraph of those 3 is really the only one that we would expect to have a lot of questions come out of it. Paragraphs 4 and 5, though, then detail a lot of reactions involving compounds A and E and F, And those are also going to be very test-worthy, as is the figure, which is a visual of all these styrene reactions. Just in case it's not perfectly clear by now, notice that there is no complicated scientific detail in this outline. There is plenty of scientific detail in the passage, plenty of things in the passage for you to refer back to if you get asked a question about it. The MCAT's basically an open book test in that way. That's not to say you shouldn't have noticed a lot of nice details when reading this earlier. Paragraphs 3, 4, and 5 read almost like a greatest hits of common reagents. We've got sulfuric acid, we've got ethanol, we've got bromine, we've got potassium bromate, we've got some acetic acid, a whole lot of things we would recognize here. And every time you read that, that molecular formula should probably flash by in your head. Sulfuric acid, oh, all the memories you've had with sulfuric acid in your chem lab, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean you need to be writing them all down in your passage outline. It might mean that you want to use the MCAT's built-in highlighting function to highlight those words. There are future lessons about how to use highlighting, how to find out whether or not it will work for you. But one thing they shouldn't do is go in your outline. Because even though this might seem a little counterintuitive, forcing yourself to write down notes for a passage actually makes you move through it faster and understand it well. Normally, when we talk about moving through a passage quickly, it means not understanding anything and wasting our time. But with a passage outline, we can move through a passage quickly and understand it enough to answer questions, and that is what we need for success on test day. And now we're here at the end of this lesson. What we explored in our 3 learning goals were steps 1, 2, and 3 of our strategy for science passages. How to quickly read and preview, what to read when you read it, and then how to write out your outline as you take notes when you read the passage. The 4th step is also to reflect. We didn't get to see an awful lot about reflect, but even in the short reviewing of our outlines that we did, we were reflecting. Just in glancing over what you've written and summarizing it again for yourself before you go to the questions, you are fulfilling step number 4. And that's it. In this lesson, you have seen all the major tools you will need to succeed on individual passages in the science sections. I'll give one last note before we finish. Sometimes, even if you never look at a passage outline again, it still helps you. Because just by writing something down, putting it in your own words, you force yourself to understand something in the first place, which sometimes at the heat of the moment, it's easy to forget is important. Anyway, good luck and work hard as you move through the homework for this lesson and future lessons and the rest of the program as well. Bye.